Welcome, listeners, to an episode of Catalyst for Societal Change and Revolution. I'm your host, Melissa, and today we're going to embark on a journey through the corridors of time, unraveling the intricate tale of revolution and the driving forces. The early decades of the 20th century marked a tumultuous epoch in Russian history, defined by the seismic upheavals of the Soviet revolutions. At the core of these transformative events lies the intricate interplay between serfdom, reform, and land disparities. The Emancipation Reform of 1861 paved the road to revolutions and the making of the Soviet Union. This reform, a watershed moment in history, not only transformed the socio-economic fabric of 19th century Russia, but also laid the groundwork for the seismic shifts that reverberated into the Soviet revolutions and the establishment of a Marxist society in the early 20th century. To understand the complexities of this historical narrative, we must first set the stage. Russia, in the late 18th century, found itself lagging behind its European counterparts, a reality starkly exposed by the defeat in the Crimean War. As discussion for reform gained momentum, the Manifesto of February 1861 was the catalyst that granted immediate personal freedom to former serfs. The remnants of the feudal system left an indelible mark, leaving a legacy of pervasive land inequality, which plunged the majority of peasants into abject. The trajectory of housing and land policies encapsulated by the Emancipation Reform of 1861 serves as a pivotal point for understanding the intricate dynamics that later fueled the Soviet revolutions. The initial discussion, spurred in the late 18th century and catalyzed by the realization of Russia's lag behind other European nations, gained momentum in the wake of the country's humiliating defeat. The subsequent manifesto marked a transformative moment by granting immediate personal freedom to former serfs, thereby initiating a comprehensive land reform process that fundamentally reshaped the deeply entrenched peasant-landlord relationship. Now let's delve into the intricacies of the land reform that followed. The land reform unfolded in two stages, with regulatory charters being signed by 1863 that regulated the peasant-landlord relationship during the transition period. These charters fixed lease payments for land use until the transfer of property rights, abolishing other obligations. The negotiation of buyout contracts between landlords, peasant communes, and the state marked the second stage, with about half of the regulatory charters resulting from mutual agreements. In instances without agreements, the local officials imposed fallback charters. The dynamics of reaching agreements were influenced by factors such as the landlord's commitment during serfdom or the attitudes and skills of local officials. The central government played a pivotal role in overseeing the reform process, deploying an independent institution of local arbitrators to ensure consistent implementation. As we will see, the emancipation of serfs, while intended to ease the plight of the peasantry, inadvertently contributed to the socio-economic discontent that became a precursor to revolutionary fervor. The reform wasn't just confined to land. It also granted civil rights to former serfs, ushering in a wave of transformative changes. The newfound liberties, including the ability to marry without permission, engage in property transactions, and represent themselves in court, were pivotal in shifting power dynamics and social structures. This transformation in property rights and civil liberties laid the groundwork for that shifting power dynamics and social structures. However, the land reform bolstered the authority of communes, particularly repartition communes, that limited land transfer rights and regulated production decisions. The communal structures introduced by the reform, especially repartition communes, brought paradoxical distortions. While it adhered to tradition, they undercut incentives for individual household land investments, introducing tensions within post-reform Russia. Furthermore, research reflects that the state financed 49-year loans to peasants, constituting 80% of the land value specified in the buyout contracts, introduced a complex financial mechanism. The timing of land buyouts were influenced by political considerations, such as the Polish Rebellion, and it varied between western and eastern provinces, impacting the transition period for former serfs. The financial intricacies, particularly the impact of landlord indebtedness, became a crucial determinant of the length of the transition period. Land use as collateral led to the deduction of landlord debts from the buyout amount, leaving landlords without funds and land lease payments. In contrast, landlords without debt received the full value of the land sold to former serfs at the buyout contract signing. These disparities in the financial implications of the reform, embedded in the broader context of land policies, economic conditions, and political events, contributed to the social discontent and inequality. Transitioning to the early 20th century, we'll explore the profound influence of land quality and historical serfdom on the outbreak of peasant unrest during the Russian Revolution of 1917. The question on the influence of housing and land policies in the early 20th century in shaping the dynamics of the Soviet revolutions finds resonance within the repercussions in the February Revolution of 1917, particularly concerning the land property of Nicholas II. After his abdication, the provisional government's handling of the emperor's land tenure showcases the complexities and regional factors at play in the transition to a Marxist society. The ill-considered resolution to declare the cabinet's lands as state property without clarifying legal basis or outlining usage led to disorder in the Altai district, which influenced local officials and radicalizing sentiments among the population. This regional context underscores the intricate interplay between land policies, social disparities, and revolutionary dynamics, which contributes valuable insights into the broader understanding of the establishment of a Marxist society during this pivotal period in Russian history. Now we're going to look a little bit more into the land quality and predictors. So, land quality and the historical prevalence of serfdom are both significant predictors of unrest in 1917 in most regressions. Unrest was greater in areas with good soil, and the economic value of the land was higher. The importance of agriculture was great as peasant livelihood depended on it. The unrest occurred in these areas more often simply because there was more to fight for. Historically, this pattern is common in Russia, as it has also been seen during the period of Russia's Great Reforms. Some unrest was driven by emotion-based resentment against the peasants' oppressors, the landlords. However, peasant-landlord tensions were a constant feature of the post-emancipation countryside and former serf regions. The abolition of serfdom led to partitioning former estate lands into landlords' private property and communal property for peasants. During this process, landlords kept the best land for themselves. Additionally, land was divided in a way that kept landlords and peasants' land holdings intertwined and therefore increased the potential for conflict and forcing peasants to rent that land. The rent for these lands were often paid for by working for the landlord at unfair rates. Challenges related to previously shared resources like forests, pastures, and meadows became more pronounced after the liberation of peasants. Following that emancipation, peasants were required to pay for access, and in some cases, permission to use these resources were limited or denied altogether. These tensions were prevalent in the period following emancipation and were escalated significantly during the Great War. Due to the shortage of labor resulting from the draft, peasants were reluctant to lease land at the rates prevalent before the war. Furthermore, the increased demand for fuel led landowners to exploit forests more intensely, reducing peasants' access to these resources. In 1917, as circumstances allowed, the existing tensions transformed into active unrest. When considering all variables and models, the distinction in the relationship between peasant unrest and either soil fertility or serfdom is less prominent than observed in the analysis of aggregated data. It's probable that peasants reacted to unique local considerations when making decisions, such as whether to appropriate meadows and forests or seize the land they did not own. The primary drivers of the unrest in 1917 were the availability of fertile land and the quest for freedom among former serfs, albeit with variations in the expressions of discontent across different regions. Shifting gears, we navigate through the unintended consequences of reforms and the theoretical frameworks of political economy. The Emancipation Reform of 1861 intended to avert an uprising. Paradoxically, it triggered widespread peasant disturbances, illustrating how reforms can function both as catalysts and substitutes for political instability. Many modern models within the field of political economy propose that the impetus for political and institutional changes stems from the apprehension of political social upheaval. While specifics may vary, these models commonly depict a bargaining scenario where a marginalized group possesses the capacity to enforce a burdensome resolution, typically through extensive social upheaval, should negotiations falter. Reform, whether in the form of policy adjustments or institutional changes aimed at enhancing the well-being of the marginalized group, diminishes the probability of resorting to this option. The only recourse for the elites, aside for reforms, is repression, which in itself incurs substantial costs. The extension of rights is portrayed as a reaction by the current rights holder to revolutionary challenges posed by the excluded group. This indicates that reform can function either as a stimulus or a replacement for political instability, given that while reform may address longstanding grievances, it could simultaneously elevate expectation among marginalized groups. However, there is research indicating that governments compelled by international influences but restricted by elite concerns can paradoxically set the stage for rebellion, particularly when there is a pre-existing capacity for collection action within the peasant population. To understand why this is specific reform aimed at preventing rebellion inadvertently promoted it, we must examine historical evidence and utilize our data on the immediate causes of disturbances. And we find that unrest was fueled by dissatisfaction with the reform process, and it was exacerbated by the influence of a nobility operating within the context of a generally weak Russian state. These grievances were intensified by elevated expectation, a byproduct of the reform, regarding the potential outcomes of coordinated action. While peasant unrest increased across the board post-reform, regions with relatively fertile soil where the value of the land was significant experienced the most disturbances driven by grievances related to liberation. Additionally, the pre-existing capacity for collective action, particularly in provinces where the peasant commune historically played a pivotal role in organizing work on the landlord's property for rent, contributed to heightened unrest. By the early 19th century, the ethical concerns surrounding serfdom had become apparent, and its continuation was not only morally troubling but also deemed perilous. However, the government was hesitant to implement radical changes, fearing potential repercussions. In 1801, Tsar Paul I was assassinated in a palace coup, partially driven by the nobility's indignation at Paul's decrees that established a legal minimal allotment of land to the serfs by the landlords. Despite these challenges, some reforms were initiated, particularly in western regions of the empire. The serfs in the Baltic gubernias, which is present-day Estonia and Latvia, were the first to be emancipated between 1816 and 1819. However, this emancipation granted individual freedom to peasants without providing them with land, keeping them reliant on their former lords as hired labor. In 1837, a significant reform was introduced, notably improving the status of state peasants. Finally, in the late 1840s, an inventory reform regulating peasants' land allotments and obligations was implemented in the right bank, Ukraine, aiming to curtail the powers of the predominantly Polish Catholic nobility. The gentry's exploitation of this process triggered widespread peasant disturbances, foreshadowing the eventual revolution. So we could kind of see a common denominator in all of these reforms, and it was a lack of land, a lack of providing to these peasants. And while the Emancipation Reform of 1861 was designed to initiate change from the highest echelons of power, it aimed to preempt the potential uprising from the lower strata of society. A large-scale revolution ended up not materializing until 50 years later. The crucial aspect from a theoretical perspective lies not merely in the survival of the Tsarist regime amid unrest, an outcome always uncertain in weaker states, but in the unforeseen consequences of the emancipation. Contrary to its intended purpose, the reform sparked disturbances among peasants across the Russian Empire, as former serfs responded to a system that favored the gentry in its design and was co-opted by the nobility against its intended objectives. The reform incited disturbances against peasants across the Russian Empire. The uprising was eventually suppressed at the time of reform, thanks in part to the backing of a largely intact and loyal Russian military. That situation would not be duplicated in 1917. Crucially, the core objective of the reform was to avoid the need for repression, with the Tsar's strong emphasis on the military serving as a diversion from the disturbances sparked by peasant uprising. Now, let's look at the challenges faced by the Russian government in implementing the reform. The absence of a robust bureaucratic structure and the nobility's control over the reform process underscored the limitations of a top-down approach. Peasant communes and peace arbitrators played crucial roles in shaping the impact of the reform. To prevent manipulation, the government had implemented peace arbitrators, which were members of the nobility responsible for confirming the legality of charters and settling conflicts between former serfs and landowners. However, despite the government's efforts, the arbitrators' composition was varied, including individuals with different political alignments and susceptibilities to local influences. Even when arbitrators were sympathetic to the emancipation agenda, landlords frequently nullified their impact using diverse tactics such as social ostracism, lodging complaints to the capital, advocating for dismissals, or resorting to physical assault. As Leo Tolstoy observed during his tenure as a peace arbitrator in Tula province, there were occasions where landlords attempted to intimidate and silence arbitrators by issuing threats of legal action and physical harm. Two key factors significantly influenced the emancipation process in the 19th century. Firstly, the occurrence of peasant events challenging the reform, such as refusals and instances of theft and violence, continued to be prevalent even after this implementation, with an additional 33 such events recorded in just 1863. Secondly, the implementation of the reform was primarily overseen by the nobility. While the broad framework of emancipation was established in St. Petersburg, the formulation of regulatory charters specifying land allotments and obligations was delegated to the landowners themselves. The absence of a robust and efficient bureaucracy in the mid-19th century, combined with the challenges posed by the arbitrary authority, hindered the central control necessary for state authorities to enforce the reform comprehensively. The lack of a national land cadastry and limited knowledge about the quality and quantity of land owned by individual gentry members further impeded effective implementation. Imperial jurisdiction had limitations, particularly concerning noble-owned serf estates, where state officials had minimal insights into the specifics of activities on individual estates. The intricate nature of Alexander II's emancipation of the serfs in 1861 shaped housing and land policies, and it laid the groundwork for later Soviet revolutions and the establishment of a Marxist society. The February 19 Manifesto represented a complex compromise. It granted serfs immediate personal freedom, but introduced a convoluted system regarding land distribution. The manifesto allowed peasants the right to redeem their houses and adjacent garden plots, but the destiny of a larger cultivated land plot was subject to the landowner's discretion. The ambiguity in land allocation options reflects a delicate balance between the desires of different societal camps, and introduced a source of disparities in land ownership. The allocation mechanisms presented in the manifesto reinforced social and economic hierarchies, and it set the stage for the disparities that did influence subsequent historical developments. The option for landowners to either sell the land to former serfs or retain ownership perpetuated a hierarchical relationship where the former serfs were either landowners themselves or remained economically dependent on the landowners. The communal aspect of the land transaction involved the entire local peasant community, created collective responsibility for redemption payments, and restricted the mobility of former serfs within the commune until full payments were made. The shelving of plans to subsidize redemption payments after the 1859 banking crisis increased the financial burden on serfs, gaining their own piece of land, and it exacerbated economic disparities and discontent. These intricacies in housing and land policies are evidenced by the February 19th Manifesto, which set the groundwork for understanding the social and economic dynamics that contributed to the Soviet revolutions. The unequal distribution of land and the economic dependencies established by the Emancipation Act fueled dissatisfaction among various social classes, and providing fertile ground for the emergence of Marxist ideals. The collective responsibility imposed on peasant communities, coupled with the economic burdens, laid the foundation for solidarity and collective action, which are key elements in the later development of Marxist societal structures in the early 20th century Russia. Alexander II's acknowledgement of the urgency to end serfdom from above rather than risk it happening from below reflects a genuine concern for preventing spontaneous peasant revolution. Additionally, there's an underscore focusing on the distributive nature of discontent among Russian serfs, aligning with the idea that peasantry could be pacified through reforms. The commitment value of land charters negotiated during the emancipation process is crucial, and influenced property rights for years post-reform. The commitment value of property rights akin to the negotiated land charters in the 19th century presents a substantive link between historical reforms and the potential mitigation of social disparities in the early 20th century, a crucial determinant in understanding the dynamics of rebellion and the establishment of a Marxist society in Russia. As we reflect As we reflect on this transformative journey, it's clear the Emancipation Reform of 1861 resonates through history. Its legacy, intertwined with housing and land policies, socioeconomic changes, and revolutionary currents, molds the course of Russian history. The complexities and unintended consequences of reform serve as a testament to the multifaceted nature of historical narratives. Peasant discontent over unequal land distribution fueled protest movements that, in turn, contributed to the rise of Marxist ideologies. The Bolsheviks, capitalizing on this discontent, implemented radical land reforms that aligned with their vision of a classless society. The centrality of land issues in this historical context underscores their profound impact on shaping the socioeconomic and political landscape of early Soviet Russia. Intellectuals like Vladimir Lenin, inspired by Marxist ideology, played a pivotal role in channeling the discontent of the peasants into a cohesive revolutionary movement. Lenin's articulation of the concept of the proletarian revolution as a means to address land and class disparities became a guiding principle for the Bolshevik Party. The Bolsheviks skillfully harnessed the grievances of the peasantry and workers to propel their revolutionary agenda. Upon seizing power, the Bolsheviks swiftly addressed the issues of land inequality. The Decree on Land, issued in 1917, mandated the transfer of land from the aristocracy to the peasants. This radical move aimed to fulfill the peasants' long-standing demands and set the stage for the establishment of a Marxist society. Communal living arrangements emerged as a tangible manifestation of those ideals, directly addressing the housing disparities. The repurposing of large estates for collective use symbolized the rejection of bourgeoisie norms and the commitment to creating a classless society. These concrete measures reflected the ideological underpinnings of Marxism and were laid down due to the inequality experienced after the reforms. In conclusion, the examination of this historical record established a direct and tangible connection between housing and land disparities, revolutionary movements, and the establishment of a Marxist society. The interplay of socioeconomic conditions, as evidenced by factual instances of housing crisis, agrarian injustice, and concrete Bolshevik responses, underscores the foundational role of these disparities in shaping the course of Russian history. The establishment of a Marxist society was not a mere ideological abstraction, but a pragmatic response to the acute socioeconomic realities faced by the majority of the Russian population. And with that, we conclude today's episode of Catalyst for Societal Change and Revolution. Join us next time as we continue to explore the untold stories that have shaped our world. Until then, this is Melissa signing off.